Hi, this is Paul. I have been for a while now listening to, kind of watching Rebel Wisdom work their videos around sense making. That's part of the theme that they've been using, and watching a lot of their sense makers. Maybe it's just because I'm a pastor, but it often seems to me that it's very much a religious quest. What do I mean by religion? In my recent videos, I've differentiated between what I call religion W, is religion as worldview, and religion S, which is sort of how religion is conceived and the definition that it's used by, within the secular frame. And so religious people are people who go to church and they believe in perhaps supernatural deities, and they pray, and they conduct rituals, etc., etc. Last night I actually did about an hour and a half of commentary on Brett and Heather's Dark Horse podcast number 50. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to integrate this perhaps at the end of it. I only covered about a half of their video, so I'm not quite sure what I'll do. I might post it on the Vanderclips channel. We'll see. But also, Big Brother Eric has sort of been back on the portal and did a massive 5-hour podcast with Douglas Murray. And I haven't had a chance to listen to the whole thing. I will admit that I'm not terribly motivated to listen to the whole thing because I suspect it's a lot of things that I've heard. I've taken a look at both of Douglas Murray's books. I've heard Douglas Murray on a variety of podcasts, and I find him helpful to listen to, but I don't find him bringing out a lot of new things. After I've listened to a few hours of Douglas Murray, I sort of get the shtick. And, part of where Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying begin in episode 50 of The Dark Horse is talking about the fact that there's sort of a lot of exasperated shock at the loss of classic liberalism in contemporary Western culture right now. And there's just a lot of talk of, here's another illustration, here's another illustration, here's another illustration. And to me, it's kind of like, yeah, I've seen tons of it. You don't have to convince me. I already agree. The question is, okay, what are you going to do about it? And I sort of hear, well, Brett and Eric, their answer of what are you going to do about it is, well, let's start podcasts. And they both have very successful podcasts. And to me, it's sort of like, let's become online preachers. Because, well, and just starting to listen to how, so Eric on his podcast often does a little monologue at the beginning. And I often find that that's probably the part of his podcast I'm most interested in. I'm most interested in his monologue and hearing what he has to say. So I thought, well, maybe let's take a little peek into what he has to say. And I think it just sounds astoundingly religious.
Hello all. The subject of this audio essay is my absence, the tech platforms, the 2020 election, Gene Seberg, and oddly enough, Article 58 of the former Soviet Union's Russian Penal Code. I don't want to say too much quite yet about what I've been up to, but suffice it to say that I'm fine, or at least as fine as anyone is in 2020.
And there's just sort of, I don't want to say what I've been up to. It's a secret. I'm planning something. It's going to be great.
Also, rest assured that I have not forgotten about you all or lost interest in the podcast.
Now, I could think about mooks and knights here, but I don't want to be dismissive. I think Eric Weinstein is tremendously earnest with this. And when I look at Eric and Brett, they want to save the world. But again, once you get into the world-saving business, that's religion W. That's just totally the religious project.
Or more importantly, our community. Far from penal code. I don't want to say too much quite yet about what I've been up to, but suffice it to say that I'm fine, or at least as fine as anyone is in 2020. Also, rest assured that I have not forgotten about you all or lost interest in the podcast, or more importantly, our community.
Is it a church? Again, going back and looking at, the sociologist who wrote Bowling Alone. The congregationalization of religion that hits the American shores. This is our community, and by establishing our community with me as the leader, I will, maybe we can save Western civilization.
Far from it. In fact, it's the exact opposite of that. I want to ensure that we can continue talking and building the community that has sprung up around the podcast. Portal Nation, if you will, is a place where I choose to spend my own free time with perhaps less distance than I should have with my audience, as many of you have become my friends.
And I think about the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, I no longer consider you my disciples, I consider you my friends. And here's Eric sort of doing the same thing.
Some time ago, I started warning many of my friends to be very careful on the internet in the immediate run-up to the 2020 U.S. election.
It's apocalyptic.
In particular, I warned people associated with the intellectual dark web that they should be very careful not to lose their accounts.
Oh, you might get kicked off Twitter and Facebook. Well, that's really sounding familiar.
In the time since, we have seen new levels of bizarre behavior on Twitter and Facebook which seem to be catching up to Google in terms of naked attempts to manipulate the national conversation.
Okay, well, naked attempts to manipulate the national conversation, as if this is new. At our meetup the other night, I reminded people, and many, agreed, who you just don't have to know a lot of American history. Just look at 19th century American history. Newspapers were at the forefront of American social and political struggles right from the start. Ever since I just started a new book that Tom Holland mentioned on his Twitter feed, Reformations, and I'm just into the first chapter now and loving it. And it just, it shows the proliferation of the printing press. I talked about this with Ryan Bennett and how the printing press just completely transformed the late medieval period into the modern period. And I mentioned, when you think of Kansas, bleeding Kansas, well, what were they called? The guys from Missouri who came up to try to make sure that Kansas would be a slave state because they're worried about everybody's counting senators. And it's like, boy, this is an old game, counting senators, right? And so these folks from Missouri, and what did they do? They had Lawrence, Kansas, which was an abolitionist, was a free state city, and they snuck in there. And what did they do in Lawrence, Kansas? They smashed the printing presses. Why? Well, this is an old thing. And the relationship between Hearst and the start of the Spanish-American War, Google that little enterprise. And the Bay of Tonkin incident. Oh, how do you move mass opinion? Well, move the channels, and this has been a big part of the conversation. I'll get to that soon.
Not all of it is sinister, mind you. I don't hate having actual facts checked by true fact checkers, although the words actual and true are doing a lot of heavy lifting in the sentence.
This is sense making. This is interpretation. This is, and again, my last video I talked about Gnosticism, and Eric. It's the truth. How can we have true knowledge? Because you need the truth in order to successfully navigate the world. And the big deal that Brett and Eric have been making in Rebel Wisdom, and really this whole IDW, and alternative sense making. Well, that's pretty much exactly what religion is and does. When I saw this crucifix with a big white Donald Trump with a MAGA hat on the internet, I thought, oh yeah, because of course, Donald Trump is the first post-truth president. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's fake news, and I'll play a little bit more of Eric's podcast in a few minutes. I just want to focus on, again, what is religion? And religion, we imagine, is just this little corner of the world that has been sort of, it's been resisting the dispelling of the French philosophes and the Enlightenment, but it's sort of hanging on. And Sam Harris and celebrity atheists imagine that now finally we can be rid of it. And it's like, well, you're a few hundred years too late to that game. In fact, There's absolutely zero. Oh, but the rise of the religiously unaffiliated. But yeah, check Clay Rutledge. That doesn't mean they're not looking at astrology and they're just having a more disorganized religion. Well, if you haven't seen it, Tom Holland's video, Did Religion Exist in the Ancient World? The Greeks weren't being religious. They were using their technology. And just on Netflix last night, fascinating new documentary about these tombs finding this priest. Well, and they're talking about what a high priest is. Well, a high priest is an intermediary between Pharaoh and the gods and between people and the gods. And so this priest amasses amazing wealth. And what is this tomb? This tomb is technology in order to secure for that priest a wonderful afterlife. And of course, materialists look at this and chuckle and say, ha, 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 how foolish these ancient people were. Well, how do you know how good old Wati is in his afterlife right now? Maybe maybe when you die, you're going to, get to the great beyond. And who's the dude with all the servants and stuff? Well, that's Wati, because, he built the temple. And all you Westerners, y'all were wrong. And so, what is religion? Religion is a sense-making apparatus. It's an interpretive apparatus, and it's how we see the world. It's what we see the world through. And when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except by me," that's sense-making at a massive scale. And Jesus Christ remade sense-making in the most utter revolutionary way that this is Tom Holland's whole thesis, because when he sort of deconstructed Islam, and a lot of Muslims didn't like what he had to say about the origins of their holy book from a modern historical viewpoint, someone said, "Why don't you do that to your own?" And Tom Holland had to say, "Well, what is my own religion? Is it Christian? No, I gave up Sunday school because they didn't like the dinosaurs." And he starts digging into the Enlightenment faith. And what's Tom Holland been doing? Well, when Tom Holland, at the end of his conversation with Glenn Scrivener, says, I'm basically leaning into the myth. I'm leaning into the narrative. I'm leaning into the story. What is he doing? That story is now the great story of the West that arose from Jesus Christ. And I think, in all fairness, listening to, again, some of what Heather said in the commentary and Dark Horse 50, I couldn't believe it right there in that podcast, where basically says, well, the Enlightenment picked up on some of the, picked up on Jesus. And I thought, yeah, that's right. I had a friend call me the other day, and he was talking about his frustration with not only ancient Christians, but really medieval Christians once they came into power, burning people at the stake. Mentioned the canons of Dort. Used to have a church council. The losers of the church council don't just, sulk away and go to court to try to keep their buildings after the church split. The losers of the fight of the church council usually wind up losing their heads or burned to a stake or hanging from a gallows. Well, thanks to the Enlightenment, a lot of that stopped, and this particular person who's a Christian said, "I think that's very Jesus-like." And I'd say, I think you're right. We didn't quite figure that out until the Enlightenment, and now many of us Christians live that way. And so there's no undoing any of these processes. I mean, how did, if you're a Christian today and you believe in separation between church and state, you sort of have to thank Voltaire and Rousseau for all the other things that Voltaire and Rousseau said and did that you might not appreciate. Well, there it is. That's how we're living today. And another comment I made in that commentary video, I don't know what I'll do with that video yet, but I mean, I do really make this stuff up as I go along, in case you can't tell. Because if I weren't making it up as it went along, it would probably be a lot briefer and less rambly. But you seem to like the rambling, which part of me still really can't figure out. What was I saying? I've distracted myself. But part of, Brett has this really, I think, very insightful commentary that Christianity is grows out of the phylogenetic tree of Judaism, and then Judaism is basically mimetically influenced by Christianity. And the Protestant Reformation grows out of the phylogenetic tree of the Roman Church, which grows out of the pre-Great Schism ancient church, but then Protestantism impacts the Roman Catholic and now the Orthodox Church in America. That's sort of the way history goes. And religion is very much the sense-making. And this is what really frustrates the celebrity atheists, because all those nasty evangelicals are trying to teach creation in public schools and voting to, make sure there's enough justices at the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you listen to Richard Dawkins' appearance on Unbelievable, again, it's an amazing show. Richard is talking to a Jewish rabbi and a Christian minister, and Richard Dawkins basically says, "Well, I don't have a problem with you two because you two are educated. It's all of those Christians in America who are, impacting the public schools." Well, what is the public school system? Well, the public school system is the state getting into sense making at a very low level, and now that at least the classical liberals and the IDW are all upset at wokeness, Brett and Heather can go on hour after hour hand-wringing about the fact that the woke are now in the schools and teaching this to kindergartners and first graders, and off we go. So how does religion work? Well, Alex Jones is a shaman. Well, he is kind of. He sort of distracts the stream, as does Kanye. Classical liberalism is kind of peak Enlightenment values, continually, slowly updated as we go through time. Religion works, religion-esque. Well, Enlightenment-fueled rise of religion-esque makes people imagine that religion is about supernatural things, and regular life is unreligious. And I think Tom Holland basically destroys that in his book and says, no, secularity is a product of Christianity. And as I wrote in my piece for John Vervaeke's book, it's Christianity's sort of secret second. It's the church's secret second sister. Nobody notices her because they both get off the boat on India with the Raj, and the Indians are like, yeah, we're not really going to become Anglican, but yeah, we'll become secular. And after losing the First World War, the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, that, again, in the book on Reformations, begins at the end of the 15th century when the Ottoman Turks are just conquering and conquering and conquering. And by the end of the 19th, by the beginning of the 20th century, they're about ready to topple over, and they basically throw up the white flag. Now, we're not going to be called Christians. That would just sort of offend our tribal nature. Ataturk says, we'll be secular. And of course, Wahhabi and what happens in Saudi Arabia then, of course, changes the script with resurgence Islam and on and on and on and on and on. But what is religion? Well, secular is religious, just in a different way. It's religion W. It's not religion S. And now, religion S isn't a bad definition. It's a perfectly useful definition. And why is it useful? When we use it, we know what we're talking about. Religion S is about that which is beyond nature. I'm rereading C.S. Lewis's Miracles, and Lord willing, have a conversation with John Vervaeke and J.P. Marceau about a really excellent article that J.P. Marceau wrote on C.S. Lewis's Miracles and John Vervaeke's work. And so I'm excited to have that conversation. I'm just re-listening to Miracles until it got preempted by Reformations. I'm way too ADHD. The Enlightenment was so powerful as a civilization, we imagined we possessed the monarchical vision. And that's in many ways what secularism is. We now see the world as it is, scientism. We now see everything as it is, and we forget that we are pattern-seeing patterns, and the patterns that we are obviously affect what we see. Standpoint epistemology has its point. So this supposed monarchical vision creates principalities around scientism. Now we can all agree on the basis of science. And again, after the Reformation was all about the texts, in many ways, the late Renaissance period, well, that didn't resolve anything. Luther imagined, well, now if we can all get around the Bible and reason, the Bible plus reason will mean consensus, and it did not mean consensus. Bible and even Carlsbad couldn't agree. Karlstadt couldn't agree on what it would mean. So basically, modernity offers this new monarchical vision, this view from nowhere. And it is sort of naive standpoint epistemology that one is seeing the world as it is. And hence, woke is really a religion because it looks at science and says, well, it looks at science selectively and even math, as Brett and Heather point out, and says, well, that's all done by white men. Well, so are cars and airplanes and a whole bunch of other stuff in modern civilization. And I'll actually respect your standpoint epistemology more when I see you give that stuff up. Because, hey, technology's downstream from science. And so one must be outside the system to do it. And of course, that is the promise of modernity, that we can somehow transcend all of these religious traditions and therefore get at truth and life as it is, and the fact that secularism is now receding around the world, as Tom Holland notes, that India is now building new temples because to be Indian does not mean to be secular, and the Hagia Sophia is being rededicated as a mosque. Yeah, standpoint epistemology is having its day. Every sage, every prophet, every preacher invites the audience to believe with its interpretive key. And, well, I listened a few times to Eric with Ross Douthat. And basically what Eric says is that, Jesus smuggling. Well, what is Jesus smuggling? It isn't just bringing Jesus into the conversation. It's sort of offering Jesus as the pat answer, as the interpretive key, and that then becomes distasteful. But every sage, every prophet, every preacher sort of, that's the whole gig of offering the interpretive key. And so basically what Eric is doing in his podcast is saying, I'm seeing through the it used to be just the right that I don't believe the mainstream media. That's been something that the right has been saying for a long time. And now the IDW and the left are saying it. And Dave Rubin, if you want to hear it said over and over and over and over and over again, just go listen to Dave Rubin. He doesn't seem to tire of saying it at all. But the point is that pretty much a lot are believing it, and more people are looking at mass media and saying, it's just sort of propaganda. And the whole, what is the truth about Hunter Biden? I have no idea. But is the mass media necessarily being terribly helpful about it? Suddenly we're all skeptics, and we're all standpoint epistemologists, and we're all, the imagined monarchical vision, that's going away. And lots are coming up and saying, I'll present the truth to you. Together we'll discover and find the new trail forward.
The idea for the warning was simple. Back in November of 2016, I started commenting on the idea that the, quote, fake news, close quote, panic was not authentic, that it was likely constructed in November of 2016 as a placeholder to be used by institutions stunned by the results and rocked in their faith that they could broadly control every election to make sure that both candidates were broadly acceptable to the institutional class, with no Ralph Naders, Ron Pauls, Ross Perot's, or Bernie Sanders to worry about. Now, that is an odd thing to say. What does that mean, inauthentic or constructed? Many of you are no doubt thinking, I remember everyone talking about fake news all during the election. Isn't that interesting? Because that is not what happened at all. That's a fake memory, and it's not even yours. In fact, as late as the end of October of 2016, almost no one was talking much about fake news. In fact, the concept didn't really spike until after Trump's victory. It was not until the week of Sunday, November 13th, 2016, that the hypnotic and invariant phrase fake news exploded and went from being an extremely minor news story to the supposedly settled explanation for everything that had caught the New York Times, the Democratic Party, and the heavily anti-Trump tech giants measuring the Oval Office drapes while about to lose the race of a lifetime. Which is to say, I wasn't buying it. I just sat there and watched helplessly as everyone I knew responded to the perseverated phrase being repeated into their minds. Interestingly, this was seemingly an exact repeat of the so-called Dean Scream, which occurred 12 years earlier on Monday, January 19, 2004, when the news media destroyed the political campaign of Howard Dean over a total and complete non-event by perseveration alone to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or FUD as it is known to conspirators who practice this disinformation technique. At that time, the entire United States, save for a few contrarians, got brainwashed into seeing a candidate supposedly lose his mind on stage, which would never have occurred to anyone if the institutional media hadn't repeated it into a so-called alternative fact in the minds of Americans. If you doubt me, Dave Rubin and I arranged to have me on his show, The Rubin Report, before Trump's inauguration so that there would be a permanent archival record of my claims, and to which all folks who would later question these claims could return. I further went to the trouble before the election of having my employer acquaint everyone in the firm with the theory of preference falsification due to economist Timur Kuran, one of our first guests, because I was all but certain that the polling data and the gated institutional narrative had not accounted for people lying about their hidden support for Donald Trump. And perhaps now you understand more about the title of the last Portal episode as a mildly coded message to my treasured audience. I once again suspected that almost everybody who is not sufficiently disagreeable to be considered Milgram negative, Ash negative, and Zimbardo negative, according to the three famous psychology experiments, was about to go completely insane as we did 4 years ago.
Be of good cheer, little flock. Stick with me. We will overcome the world. Now, of course, Eric's a really smart guy, and he's got all these words, and some of these words can give the fancy Vervaeke words a run for their money. Isn't this it? See, here's the challenge. Well, modernity is sort of this naive standpoint epistemology, monarchical vision where, well, we see everything. Well, if you're talking this way, you're being fooled. And so now suddenly we're back into Gnostic land, and there's secret information, and the Weinstein brothers are smart enough and well-positioned enough and keeping track enough, and now have their podcasts and their organisms and their group of people behind them, and well they'll lead you into the truth because they know it. This is religion. Now, the big daddy of the new wave of the IDW is, of course, Jordan Peterson. And I don't know that anyone has made, at least over the last 4 years in the Western world, a bigger splash than him as prophet, as guru, as sage. And I've talked to many people, and, when Jordan Peterson spoke on Joe Rogan, suddenly just lights went on, and people couldn't get enough of him and doing the deep dives into his videos. And I went along and I did the same thing. And it's just like, wow, this is powerful religious stuff. What do I mean by religious? Now, again, in fact, Peterson was sufficiently religious-esque to make others who would sort of become his allies, like Sam Harris, at least sort of on his team. But, he's sort of the Dr. Strange of the group and got all of his little Mandelas and things going on. And that was Jordan in the group. But he's leading his minions to enlightenment. But you can see that the day of modernism is over, and as long as Eric Weinstein continues to talk in the way that he does, he teaches his audience that, well, standpoint epistemology has a point. And so even as he's flying the flag of classical liberal, he's talking and educating and teaching people that, well, basically you need an interpretive lens to see the truth. And Jordan Peterson, what he sparks off was, I thought, one of the deeper religious moments we've seen recently. Although Donald Trump claiming that he could shoot somebody in the midst of Fifth Avenue and still win the election, that's deeply religious. And so, in some ways, Eric Weinstein sort of elects himself as the Paul to Jordan Peterson's Jesus and coins the IDW phrase. But where's the IDW gone? The IDW, at least if you listen to someone who would have been their most important publisher, which is Rebel Wisdom, and many others, Ryan Bennett, I said, well, they didn't pan out. And so Eric and Brett decide to go the podcast route, and they have big successful podcasts. But so much of this, and in fact, just on the Discord server today, talking to a number of people and I've talked to a number of people just basically in the Rebel Wisdom camp that just say, talk. Well, you could say that about me because nobody talks more than I do, I suppose. I put out more hours of talking than just about anybody else who has another day job. And I suppose that Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke and I also function in this way in the Jordan Peterson wake. And, Rebel Wisdom is sort of trying to videotape a New Testament. But the conspiracy theory and the fake news are sort of the seeing stones by which to interpret the golden tablets that affords a new vision that reveals the new authoritative history. And by virtue of having to see through things, there's no going back to the simplicity of a previous era of mass media where Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. And when Walter Cronkite said it, you knew it was the truth. And there were dominant narratives that held the nation together. America was a massive sense-making apparatus. American media was a mass media which united the country religiously. Remember, church attendance reached its peak in American history during the Cold War. Religion S and religion W meet. Religion is about actions and behaviors and watching each other act it out. TV perpetuated and groomed the culture in a way that newspapers couldn't. You just look at this picture of Walter Cronkite on the evening news, and every little detail in the picture just speaks of that era. And those of you who are old enough, like I am, like Brett is, like Eric is, to have been children. I remember Walter Cronkite on the TV when I was a child. We've seen the turning of the page. One of the points made by Reformations, I'm going to have to put the link to that in the notes. One of the points of the book Reformations, and now here another book is colonizing my podcasts, is he says, and again, when I heard this, I thought, why did no one, year after year in Christian schools in the Christian Reformed Church, I received instruction in the Protestant Reformation, good old 1517 and Luther's 95 Theses. Why didn't anybody note that all of the reformers were born at the latter? It's the obvious thing. All of the reformers Luther was 37 when this happens. The world was changing dramatically. The Columbian Exchange, as Charles Mann, the author of 1493, says, was happening. And, the Portuguese were making their way around the Horn of Africa, and Isabel and Ferdinand need something to counter Portugal. And so they take a chance on this Italian Cristobal Colombo to sail west and use Ptolemy's measurements, hopefully to hit China. And then they start hitting these islands, and they call them the Indies and the Indians, and the world is changed, so that at the end of the 15th century, you've got Columbus and you've got the printing press, and change. And that's the environment in which Luther is raised, and in some ways in the environment of the millennials today, where the world is just changing. Makes it hard to maintain the monarchical vision of modernism when basically Eric Weinstein says, well, it's fake news, and they've been doing the fake news for a long time, and TV perpetuated and groomed a culture in a way that newspapers didn't. World War II and the Cold War united America and the West in an existential way to battle Nazis and communists. But 9/11 was the iconic end of that era. How to understand the Islamic attacks. And of course, at that point, you had the rise of the new atheist, the celebrity atheist, that were going to say, aha, it's religion. It's religion that's the problem. And whereas for a long time, the history and the science, the geology and the anthropology of humanity was undermined by science, but the morality, you could still go to the Bible for morality. And then at the end of, it began in the 60s, and by 9/11, it sort of caps it. No, you can't trust religion. And then we have the war within the left of Islam. Is Islam a religion of hate? And so, well, Ben Affleck versus Sam Harris. How to understand Islamic attacks, a continuation of a very old and long war, beginning with the rise of Islam and the Crusades up to the fall of the sixth man in Europe. A lot of people thought at the end of the First World War that Islam as a religion was done for. Well, apparently not. 9/11 attackers were not ancients. They weren't just Bedouin out in the desert keeping their sheep by night. These were men who were the sons of the elite of the Islamic world, who were trained in Western schools and went to places like Patterson, New Jersey, 3 blocks from my house, to blend in with the rest of the population there in anticipation from taking the planes from Boston. These were people fully familiar with the modern world, and in some ways ahead of the curve of the IDW and Brett and Eric Weinstein of saying, we can't believe it anymore. And, if they were Christian, they would have joined the Orthodox Church. Only, of course, it really matters what your religion is about. And you might say, well, I'm not trying to throw Muslims under the bus. It's just that I understand the diversity within religions. And so it kind of matters how your founding father, Jesus or Muhammad, lived their life, and how the stories get perpetuated and what stays at the center of it. And again, you can read 2 of Tom Holland's book, In the Shadow of the Sword and Dominion, because one follows the other, because Holland writes In the Shadow of the Sword as a modernist historian and says, I got some questions about the Islamic origin story. And he says, well, do your own research. And that's where we get Dominion. Watch the struggle for the heart of Western Islam play out on Twitter in the wake of the French attacks just this week. We're looking for someone to break the script. And I said in the commentary on Brett and Heather, in some ways, the IDW is sort of the Tea Party of the left. Brett Weinstein is in some ways analogous to the Tea Party of the left, as is Antifa and the woke. They don't believe in the sense-making apparatus anymore, and it's fragmenting in all sorts of different directions. And, well, what? And so then Kanye comes in his shamanic ways of talking, where he sort of blends all of the streams together and comes full-throated, a full-throated evangelical Black American Christian with a preacher from Masters University. Just blows my mind. Hard to conceive. Looking for someone who will really tell the truth. Yeah. Donald Trump in a MAGA hat on a crucifix. It's kind of where we're at, isn't it? So nostalgia and trying to recapture the memory of certainty. And so I see, in some ways, Donald Trump, Dave Rubin, Never Trumper Rod Dreer, and Brett and Heather. Well, we've got to sort of get back to stability and certainty, but you're not going to get there making podcast intros like this one.
Go. It is simply too hard for ordinary people whose ability to feed their families depends on working for institutions to resist the drumbeats of either the Democratic or Republican master narratives.
Mid-century modern, the path to status and wealth was working in institutions. Get that job with IBM, get that job. And of course, Eric has been talking about the ways that, well, the institution sort of figured out, throw the American worker under the bus and, outsource your job to India and China and Vietnam and other places in the world. And, well, isn't it your fiduciary responsibility to make as much money for your shareholders as possible? And so you have really globalists like Brett and Eric who very quickly start making nationalist turns. And, well, how can the regular man figure this out? Well, the elite who know the secret knowledge of what happens in boardrooms behind the scenes, this is all covered up, everything that you're told is a lie. We're kind of in Alex Jones land, aren't we? Kanye West. So, Jonathan Peugeot, follow the fools. Because when everything is upside down, sometimes the fool is right side up.
Now, most of you in my audience were born after 1980, and so you cannot obviously remember the revelations of the mid-1970s the way I do when I was around 10 years old. But for me and others in progressive American families, the revelation that the FBI had secretly planted totally false stories like the one that destroyed the reputation, career, and ultimately the sanity of law-abiding progressive Hollywood star Gene Seberg in mainstream newspapers and news magazines like the Los Angeles Times and Newsweek casts a long shadow. The reason is simple. We have all the chilling receipts, as the kids say today. The idea of the U.S. deep state's use of mainstream media to destroy lawful citizens' lives and sanity simply for political beliefs is not a conspiracy theory. It is, in fact, a 100% certain conspiracy fact that for some odd reason isn't taught much in U.S. high schools. It is also the reason that we must investigate the investigators and eavesdrop on our own spies if we wish to remain a truly free society. Well, I am of the belief that destroying people is considered fair play in elections by the insiders who view these contests as their own private blood sport, to which ordinary dissenting Americans are viewed as interlopers and thus prey. And increasingly, very few of us outsiders seem to believe in democracy anymore, as we increasingly believe that our side must always win against the implacable foe by any means necessary, to quote Brother Malcolm.
Now, there was a really and I've never been able to find it, and I think it was Eric Weinstein on Dave Rubin, where Eric, and I completely agreed with him, basically said that, in order to actually live within this democratic frame that we've set up, it has to be okay with you to lose sometimes. And that, well, what does that mean? It means that there's actually another deeper narrative at play, or perhaps another guiding hand at play. And again, what's been interesting about Eric and Brett is sometimes they can sound so religious while they're not religious at all.
When this sport of personal reputational destruction is coordinated by members of the complex formed by institutional media, the intelligence community, the political parties, political consultants, finance, tech, and the academy, I call it Seberging to remind us of just how real the threat is to all who have idiosyncratic politics but who have done nothing legally wrong. Now, as many of you might guess, if I had a strong belief that I could do something to save us by telling you to vote Biden or vote for Trump, I don't think I would let this stand in my way. But truth be told, I don't think we are playing the lady and the tiger with these two parties anymore. It's more like the Bengal tiger versus the Siberian tiger. So naturally, I was trying to figure out any way to plausibly open both doors to try to get the two parties to focus on eating each other rather than the rest of us.
Now again, well, how do we save the world? Well, now the secularism shines through. It's the modern direct political approach. And I would say this is where you're probably most wrong. I'm a political skeptic and a religious believer, and I think if you have that the other way around, your politics becomes your religion.
And I'm sorry to say that I, along with absolutely everyone else I know, have failed to come up with any plausible options.
We're in trouble.
We seem to be on autopilot. We have built institutions that are going to oversee our undoing unless someone figures out a way to stop playing with the failed septuagenarians and octogenarians who came in as young people to the national stage in the 1970s and have rewritten the rules for their own plunder and enrichment for 30 to 50 years.
That's the plot.
This essay is a bit heavy, right? Well, pause the audio. Pace yourself. Take a deep breath. Maybe think about puppies? I don't know. Continuing. So to sum up the above, I don't believe almost any of what we are talking about on a daily basis makes any sense. We are going to wind up with one of two candidates that should not be running for control of the nuclear missile launch codes. 4 years ago, I called the 2016 election the Sophie's Choice election, and I barely got myself to vote for Hillary Clinton, who I could not stand. This year, I put the pen directly over Biden's name and could not get the pen to move towards the paper. This was a bit of a surprise. That's never happened to me before, where I could not vote for my own party.
This is interesting because we're mysteries to ourselves. And I was talking to someone who was talking about voting, and people talk and talk and talk, and then they go to the poll and bang. And my there's a story in my family of when I think it was Goldwater was running, and my grandfather, a bunch of his kids were like, you're not going to vote Republican again. You're not going to vote Republican again. And they'd kind of talked him out of it. And when he came back from the vote, the poll, who did you vote for, Dad? Too old to change, he says. I mean, there's something that happens in us that there's a consciousness Congress, and one's moving our lips, but boy, that elephant has a mind of his own.
Was it true that I had become a Trump supporter? I tried the same Ouija board maneuver, and this time I couldn't even get the pen to hover over Trump's name.
He wrote in Kanye. I just know it.
So what was happening? Well, I won't bore you with who I voted for because it doesn't matter.
Oh, that wouldn't bore us.
I'm only telling you this because I failed this basic test and threw my vote to someone who will not win.
He voted for Kanye.
With that, I will promise you that I will not judge you for your vote.
Because after all, the problem if you have a God is you have to worry about what's on his mind. Same with your prophet.
You cannot do worse than I did, so I have no way to blame you for whichever way you choose to fail. This is not the Sophie's Choice election. This was actually supposed to be the King Solomon election in my mind, where if either candidate truly loved the country more, he would have been the first to resign. So, getting back to my absence, I became convinced that the portal was of very little value to you in the election per se. Many of you flattered me by saying, "Where are you when we need you most?" as if I had somehow abandoned you.
Mooks and knights.
And I am touched, but that is not where we are. I don't have your answers, and I am lost as well, so I have been trying to look past the election for months. I'm just being honest here. Whatever we are going to do to save ourselves from the kleptocrats of the center, the nutjobs of the far right, the apathy of the non-voters, the woke lunacy, and the dreamers of third-party options, we are going to do with either Trump or Biden in office.
We're starting to leave politics behind, or are we? I mean, when are Brett and Eric going to try and start a new political party for 2024? I mean, that would be the reasonable thing to do within their worldview. Now, I'm a religious person, and so what do? I gather little groups of people together and get them talking. And I preach my sermons, and I do my thing. That's what I do. This is religion.
4 years ago, before Trump took the oath of office, I was at a dinner in Los Angeles with Sam Harris and Dave Rubin. Sam was talking about how he was going to have to hold Trump accountable with his broadcasts, and I said something that I'd like to think turned out to be wise. "Sam, you just can't do that," I said. He asked why I would say that given my feelings, which were not out of line with his. I said, "I've studied Trump's style, and it's based around deliberate ambiguities that left and right can be counted upon to hear as meaning different things. If Trump makes n-nested ambiguous statements in a minute, he will create a minimum of 2 to the n legs of the decision tree that must be considered given your strategy.
Dude, we're not all mathematicians.
He will thus be able to force you and the rest of the unsuspecting United States public intellectuals to waste much of your intellectual life for 4 to 8 years picking up after him.
That's true.
He just needs to knock over the intellectual vases faster than you can glue the shards back together. And no matter how good you aren't going to make it through like that. So what will you do instead, he asked. I said, I will make one or more clear statements that Donald Trump represents an existential risk to the fabric of the United States, and that I expect he will use his freedom as an outsider to do a combination of both very good and very bad things. But I'm not going to let him run my intellectual life every day on his truly ingenious brain farts.
That's basically what I told a lot of people. I said, if you're against Trump, don't give him so much of your thought world. He's going to be president for 4 or 8 years. That's just the way it is.
I will then focus my energy and attempt to hold my own party, the Democrats, intellectually accountable so that we can win with someone we can believe in.
How'd that go?
And except for that part at the tail end, I think I did about as well as I could have in anticipating the problems and formulating a strategy during these 4 years.
Not so well.
So why be absent? Well, I haven't gotten to the part about Article 58 yet. Recall that I don't believe that fake news was an authentic narrative in November of 2016. So what was it then? Well, I don't know. But if I had to guess, I would say that there was probably a meeting somewhere around early November of 2016 where it was decided that the United States...
Meeting of who? By who? I mean, the maybe there was a meeting, maybe there wasn't. But again, the point is, well, what are principalities and powers? It's that it's not necessarily all these little conscious agents who are doing things. Stuff gets into the zeitgeist. These are the patterns, and it's school spirit. Well, what is school spirit? Is there a little group of people that sit down and have a meeting about school spirit? Yeah. But does that create school spirit? No. So what is spirit? What is spiritual? This here is really prologue to the Gospel of Eric. And, Douglas Murray, who is in many ways a smarter, better placed Dave Rubin, he's gay, so you got to smuggle that little update in. He's a true believer of the lost consensus, recapturing reform of the classical liberalism against impending chaos. Heir of George Orwell, dead prophets make the best prophets. Weinstein's, live this evergreen experience and are trying to work the preacher, prophet, interpreter mode with the utmost of zeal. And so what they're trying to do is, in fact, find their religion.
November of 2016. So what was it then? Well, I don't know. But if I had to guess, I would say that there was probably a meeting somewhere around early November of 2016 where it was decided that the United States needed a narrative to buy time for its aggrieved institutions so that the 2020 election could be fixed to the greatest extent possible. It was likely the placeholder that had been settled upon.
Who's at this meeting? Here's the funny thing about human beings at a meeting. That very quickly, just like, again, we use the word school spirit, a zeitgeist takes over in a meeting. We see this all the time. You see this in religious circles. And now it has everything to do with who's in the room. It has everything to do with all kinds of things that aren't in the room. And it governs and controls and leads and creates. And now, okay, the fixed election. Well, usually when we mean a fixed election, we mean that someone out there is planning the outcome of this election, and it doesn't have anything to do with the votes that are being cast. What are you saying with this stuff?
That would be the origin of the gradual changes in terms of service across Twitter, Facebook, and Google, and how the structural changes were coordinated that would gradually erode all protections for free speech across the platforms.
So in other words, the Facebook and Google and Twitter are all conspiring to put Joe Biden in office. Well, but is it, see, here's the thing. It's like as I can't say I had a mishap in terms of not hitting the record button, and so there's a whole lot of video that didn't get recorded. When AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile price fix, they don't have to call each other up and say, okay, let's set a line at $40 a month for this kind of tier of service. They just look at each other. They look at each other's pricing, and they guess, and they anticipate, and they do it together. This is where, again, we're talking. The ancients had language for this that Eric is really striving to get at, but Eric doesn't have a metaphysic that affords thinking about it. There's something going on in the heavenlies. There's something going on between the people. There's something going on in the minds of the people. There's something that is possessing the people in charge, the people in control. And so now they're going to somehow corral all of the little underlings who are on Facebook and Twitter and Google, and they're all going to manipulate this, but they can't make it look too obvious. And now, again, I'm not a skeptic that these corporations have political preferences or that they'd really like to get Biden elected, and that our sense-making apparatus is being tinkered with. The point is that if you're going to have a language to deal with this, if you're going to deal with it in one way or another, it's not materialistic. All of the religious language is available, and he's just sort of like someone who's coming up to bat. He's going to swing the bat with one arm, and it's like, well, have you read much ancient history?
That's where Data and Society and its crazy guilt by association minus any methodology technique appeared. In essence, the 4-year battle plan was to figure out how to use the fake news meme to gain greater narrative control of the news. Only there was a new problem. We, the people, had become enmeshed in the news. We shared stories.
We, the people, had become enmeshed in the news. When haven't we? You're talking about social media. And yes, people are being corralled, and then people do as people do. They're like herding cats. They do unexpected things. And then we, the people, who does that mean? Again, another principality.
Stories and links. And to control the news now meant the institutions had to control us as ordinary people much more aggressively. We all opined often, and often better than the professional commentariat at that. And long-form podcasting, as led by the popular Joe Rogan, became seen as the great embarrassment and threat to mainstream legacy media. People dying to be treated like adults with long attention spans dropped NPR, and the New York Times is home to the 1619 Project, which its leader openly admitted was attempting to get America to riot, and flocked to podcasts hours in length to listen to Snowden or Bernie Sanders on Joe Rogan.
Now, Joe Rogan is big amongst little small fry like me, even small fry like Eric Weinstein. And if I went on Joe Rogan, which I don't think will ever happen, would my channel get a boost? Perhaps. Jordan Peterson got a leg up. See, the problem is that I don't know what I didn't record, so if I repeat myself, forgive me. I just talked to yet another individual that was telling me about how Jordan Peterson saved his life, and he first heard Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan, and he has no one that he can talk with about Jordan Peterson around him. It's like, well, get on the Discord server. That's sort of where certain groups of people are hanging out. Why? Because it's tiny. And yeah, the New York Times is huge, and the mass media continues to be mass, and. So here's the thing. I wouldn't be surprised if, let's see, is he going to talk about Unity 2020, or did he talk about that? All right, that's the problem with what I'm doing here.
And there was no plan to stop this that was working when they finally realized just how powerful these podcasts are. You could hear Roger Penrose 1 minute and Eddie Bravo the next. Everyone knew that simply calling Sam Harris gross and racist, and Joe Rogan alt-right, Ben Shapiro a Nazi white supremacist, Peter Thiel anti-gay, Brett Weinstein anti-black, And Majid Nawaz, an Islamophobe, was beyond stupid. I mean, our audiences had spent hours listening to us and interacting with us at events. It wasn't just that the mainstream media was bullshitting the American public. They were gaslighting us all around people that we already knew, and failing so long as there were people willing to risk their reputations to shatter that evil spell. So they figured out that we needed the platforms in part to reach each other and proceeded to change the platform rules over and over again to make them vague, illogical, ideological, inconsistent, and actually impossible to understand.
In some ways, this is Eric Weinstein complaining that the teacher is no longer allowing him to pass notes. If you want to move the world, you should understand something that religious people understand. It's the network of human beings. And because you got all excited because social media now gave you an opportunity to have a platform with six-figure Twitter followers and 5 or 6-figure YouTube subscribers, and how many people on Facebook, that it's just hard to take seriously. And yeah, I'll let them keep going. Meanwhile, I just noticed an email from one of my parishioners that notes that a Christian Reformed minister from Western Michigan who resigned from his church because, well, that's just it. When I read about it in the Holland Sentinel of Holland, Michigan, and then it got picked up in the old social media, which were listservs, and I had to sort of cool one listserv down on it by saying, well, I actually didn't resign from the Christian Reformed media. He actually took an Article 17, so separated from his church, and now that's picked up by the New York Times or by the LA Times, and then one of my members sees it, and yeah, Eric, I get your point, but there's machinery to deal with this and ways of thinking to deal with this that, for the most part, you're not paying any attention to, and that really sort of surprises me.
Add to that these platforms were now patrolled by a new religious police, if you will, as if Twitter were Saudi Arabia and the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice was replaced by the Trust and Safety Committee.
Once it gets moral, now suddenly the religious bells start going off.
No one could say what the rules were. What exactly was dead naming, for example? Is saying that Bruce Jenner won the 1976 decathlon years before Caitlyn Jenner even existed a punishable offense? Only the Trust and Safety Committee could tell you. Which,
if you understand anything about where the secret sacred self is, you'll understand that conversation was always religious, far longer than before Twitter got involved.
Brings us to Article 58 of the Soviet-era Russian Penal Code, which
and now we get super esoteric.
Introduced the concept of enemy of the workers and counter-revolutionary activities as the major crime. You see, Article 58 was a law where everyone was guilty, but not everyone was prosecuted. Thus, any inconvenient person could be disappeared into the gulags or executed in show trials under Article 58.
And in a lot of ways, I just listened to this a few minutes ago because, again, I didn't hit the record button. And I don't feel like listening to it again. Yeah, I get your point. We all had this new toy, social media, and we thought that this would somehow give us power to really shape the zeitgeist. And we learned that a lot of the old rules really haven't changed that much. And just saying that there's a committee of a group of people that got together with Facebook and Google and Twitter and have decided some rules. Yeah, maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but there's other spiritual forces in the heavenlies. And again, some of you will understand what I'm saying and some of you won't. Think about school spirit. Watch the last videos that I've made. What is a spirit? How does it work? How are there spirits between us? How do they perpetuate? How do they move? This is all enormously religious. Mercy et Eliad. Homo religiosus. That's us. That's the basic layer in terms of how we construct our world, how we make sense, how we piece things together, how we work together, how we Voltron up, how we rule the world. This is a never-ending project, and if you really want to move the world, I can understand doing your podcast. but you're probably going to need boots on the ground. And what does that mean? Slumming it on a Discord server sometimes? Yeah. But it's going to mean talking to those people in your community who might have some mental illness issues. It's going to mean distributing yourself through many people by building communities of love and patience and support and care. There's a reason religious organizations are the shape they are and why these things have been so persistent throughout the years, because this is how they shape the world. And to hear he and his brother, and I think in some ways, I think Brett and Heather, I think Heather's a bit ahead of both of them in thinking these things through. And, well, maybe I will attach the Brett and Heather commentary at the end of this. I don't know. I don't have to post this till Monday, so. I think they need to think broader. Oh, there's my wife. It's time to stop this nonsense.